Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Okay, welcome to Meet the Author. My name is Joe Nash. Today we're talking to Claire Parham. She teaches at Siena College, and she's written a very interesting book just in time for the 50th anniversary of the St. Lawrence Seaway. The book is called The St. Lawrence Seaway and Power Project, an oral history of the greatest construction show on earth. So welcome, Claire. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Before we talk about the book, I always like to ask people, give us like the capsule biography of yourself. I know there's sort of a little bit of a local connection here because you're actually from up that way, you're from Watertown. So why don't you give us the capsule biography, and then we'll talk about your book.
My life in a minute, you mean?
Well, it could be as, you know.
Well, let's see. I grew up in Watertown. I went to St. Lawrence University, which is up in Canton, which is very close to where the Seaway is. I got my master's degree in labor studies at UMass Amherst, where I was there for about a year and a half, and I was a labor organizer at that time for the Nurses Association. And then I decided to go get my doctorate degree at Binghamton University in Binghamton in American history. And then I moved back here about 10 years ago, and I first started teaching at St. Rose and then at Siena.
So you've been
College.
at Siena for?
I've been at Siena since 2002.
Oh, okay. Well, one thing about the book that is very interesting is I've read myself some oral biographies and oral histories, and I really love the, I don't know, is this a genre or format? But why don't you tell us what is an oral history, and maybe why you chose this format as opposed to a narrative history or whatever?
Well, an oral history is, in many respects, because I've written a narrative history, it's a little bit harder, because you have to be able to not only interview the people about their experiences, but you have to be able to fit it into some type of logical format. And that was one of the things that was very challenging about this book. You're limited in terms of the page numbers, and there are certain things that publishers want in the book, certain things that they don't want. So it's sort of a two-part process. You have to interview the people, and then, well, actually, I should take a step back. You have to learn a lot about the subject so that you can interview the people. Yeah. Then you have to interview the people, transcribe all of the interviews, and then try to fit it into some type of comprehensible
Well, I noticed
structure.
The book has a lot of different, the chapters are on different topics.
Yes.
And you've interviewed over 50 people, and a lot of the same people come up. So then you have to what? You have to cut the interviews, if you're talking about one subject, fit it into the other chapter. So that, you know, because the same names keep coming up.
Yeah, it's very difficult. I went into these interviews with a set of questions, but the problem is a lot of times the conversation will go in a little bit of a different direction. So many times I would have to call them back and ask them for sort of a different aspect of what I'd asked them, or to emphasize something else. But I think the most difficult part with an oral history, as you said, is you have to fit these into categories, and you have to make them make sense. So as an author, you have to decide how much liberty you're going to take in terms of rearranging the interviews and making them fit. So it's a tough.
Well, I'll just tell people the topics of the chapters that you're talking about. You're cutting these up. There's a chapter on the project, and all these interviewees, which we'll talk about, they talk about the project. And there's one called The Workforce. They were from locals all over America. Life on the Job. There's a chapter called Construction Dilemmas. A chapter, it's called Off the Project, Bars, Comrade, and the Community, about very sociological, I guess.
Yes.
And then there's a chapter on the women up there, very interesting part of the book, actually. And the last chapter is all the same people that in the previous parts are talking about the job. They talk about sort of the legacy of the whole project, which is, again, very interesting. So why don't we start talking about the scope of the St. Lawrence Seaway, the project? I mean, the subtitle is The Greatest Construction Show on Earth. Tell us about the scope. I mean, I guess a good way to do it might be to compare it to the Panama Canal, which I didn't know when I read this. It's twice as long as the Panama Canal.
Yes.
The locks are like, what, 4 times higher. And they did it in like half the time and did less workers. So talk about the scope of this whole thing.
The project. The scope of the project is very interesting because it really dates back to the turn of the 20th century, because the Canadians had started to build locks on their side. The Americans had started to do a lot of dredging in the Thousand Islands section. But what's interesting about it is not only the length, but also what they were trying to do with it. This is a project where they wanted to produce power, and they also wanted to make a waterway that ships could go from Montreal to the Great Lakes.
So it's a dual.
It's a dual.
It was for transportation connecting Great Lakes, and it's for power. Okay.
Yeah, and the thing is that they had to use the natural elements that were there. And one of the things that many people point to as the Seaway taking away was something called the Long Sault Rapids. Enormous stretch of rapids. When they dewatered them, the rocks were jutting out like this. They found cannonballs in there from the war. And so they had to learn how to use what was there. And this sometimes has been a problem.
As opposed to like the Panama Canal, they just sort of made it.
Exactly. They just dug it. This one, they had to make canals and locks that bypassed the power production. They also had to make it work on both sides of the border. You're talking about a project where the Americans and the Canadians had to coordinate everything from where the water level was to how production was progressing. And probably the most fascinating part is the main power dam was built half by the Americans, half by the Canadians, in completely different ways, and they had to meet in the middle at the international border. So there's just so many aspects of it, from the Seaway part to the power production. It's a massive undertaking.
Did you interview any Canadians? And I can. In the end, it says who everyone was, but I didn't read that part.
Yes.
Well, so the bulk of the book, I mean, there is the first chapter is introductory stuff, but the bulk of the book is these interview with all these workers. And so why don't you give us a little history of, I think you said this project of yours goes back to like 1989 or something. But
it does.
Talk about the interviews and sort of how you found all these people and what all that was like.
Well, at the very beginning, when I was at St. Lawrence, we were given, actually I personally was given names of several workers to call. And when I interviewed them, I was focusing more on the accidents and because the paper that I was working on was comparing newspaper articles to their experiences. The problem I ran into when I finally was able to start working on this book in 2004 was after I had published my first book on the history of Messina and Cornwall.
Okay.
I had a problem because none of the employers or the Seaway Authority or the Power Authority, they either didn't have the employment records or they didn't want me to see them.
It was 50 years.
50 years ago.
Okay.
So what I did was, when people interviewed me about my first book, they always asked me, what are you doing next?
Oh, okay.
So I said, this project that I've been working on for almost a decade now is about the St. Lawrence Seaway Project, and I'm looking for people to interview. So little by little, letters started to come to me, emails.
I mean, people saw the article about the first book, and they somehow mentioned, I'm working on, okay.
And so they saw my email address, I gave my phone number.
Okay.
And one thing would lead to another. I would interview one worker and they would say, oh, have you talked to this person? Yeah. And what was interesting was many of them have kept in contact with each other, even though they're scattered across Canada or scattered across the United States. They still see each other at least once a year. Some of them see each other for breakfast every other day. So it's very interesting how close they've stayed. But
a lot of people came and worked on the Seaway, stayed 2, 3, 4 years, left to wherever, but somehow, well, the chapter on the camaraderie and the working and the sort of social life was very interesting, and it doesn't surprise me that they would, kept in touch. So a lot of these interviews, I think you say somewhere in the beginning, every time you interviewed someone, it led to 2 other people or something.
Did. Yeah, the first gentleman I interviewed sent me a letter. He still lives up in Cornwall, and he gave me a list of, I think it was 15 people, some of which didn't want to talk to me. This is one of the things that I ran into with it. A lot of people didn't want to talk to me
Really?
about the
That's-
project even now because they were afraid that what they might have to say might be unpopular. Some of them like to remain
Right.
anonymous. So,
Well, one thing that comes out, one part of the book that a lot of the interviewees, they mention, maybe it's when it was first started, but there was a lot of this, the locals versus the workers, and there seemed to be a lot of tension at the beginning. So
Yes.
is that the kind of things maybe they didn't want to?
it was that, and
Talk
also one of the issues that came up, and it's something that I've spoken quite in-depthly with the Seaway Authority. There is a concrete issue on the Eisenhower Lock and the
I mean,
Snell Lock.
real concrete or a concrete?
No, real concrete. The concrete is peeling and scaling off the locks because they used natural cement,
Yeah.
which is a very finicky
Yeah.
substance. It has to have the right amount of sand. It has to be poured in the right temperature. So they were a little bit worried if they talked to me about what it was like working up there in terms of the concrete and the incomplete plans and all of the stuff that possibly they wouldn't be too popular with, say, the Corps of Engineers. But what I found out is they need to rehab
Yeah,
the locks
50
and
year-
rehab
50
the
years, that
systems.
wouldn't really.
Yeah, and they don't hide it. There have been stories all over the local news, and they've gotten many substantial grants to rehabilitate the system. So in actuality, they were very happy
Yeah, okay.
that this is part of the book.
Well, I know some of the things I was reading, I went to school in Potsdam, which is close to Messina,
Yes, it
and
is.
there's the weather comes up in this all the time. I remember winters up there, but
Yeah, yeah.
a lot of the people talk about, the weather up there and was significant, and a lot of people mention Messina. They go, one of the persons said, it was like being on the frontier in 1900 or something. I'm sure it wasn't, but.
It probably was.
So talk about, you mentioned when you first did the first batch of interviews in the introduction, you said, when you went back for the second big batch, you said these interviews haunted you. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think what really drove me to do, after I did the initial interviews in 1989, was that
And that was with what, 10 people, right?
it was with
Okay.
10.
Okay.
Many of those interviews are not in this book because I couldn't find the people, whether they passed away or
Yeah.
moved away. But I think the memories that they had were so vivid, and they've remembered them for this long a period of time. And one gentleman said to me, I still wake up in the middle of the night and have nightmares about what it was like working there and wondering if something was going to fall on me, wondering if I was going to drown or if I was going to freeze to death. So they carried it with them.
Well, I should say, I haven't mentioned it yet, but it's very dangerous.
It was.
It
was.
How many people died during the whole, is there a number, or did they?
They say 20,
Yeah.
but the problem is if you were injured on the project and died 2 weeks later from pneumonia, it didn't count. So you actually had to physically die right there on the project at that moment, or it didn't count. So one gentleman in the book said, we'll never know.
Oh, God.
People-
So were there many that got injured and then maybe died within a
Yeah.
month? Oh.
From pneumonia back then.
Yeah.
A lot of the injuries were not properly treated because if they found out how severe your injury was, they would let you go. And there wasn't workers' compensation. So a lot of them hid their injuries as best as they could so that they could keep their jobs. But one of the most...
I should say, it isn't all, from reading some of the excerpts, it isn't all just, this was the greatest time of my life.
Oh, no.
But there was, well, why don't we talk about now your book, I would say, and it reminds me a lot of the Studs Terkel book, Working.
Yes,
So I
it
don't
does.
know. It reads like that, like all these different people. One thing I mentioned a minute ago, but can you talk more about this? The locals versus the incoming workforce, because these were people from all over America or the world?
The world, they did have some experts that had come.
And then they're sort of all
internationally.
descending on this little upstate New York, Messina, New York, 15,000 people at the time. And
Yeah.
a lot of the people talk about, well, when we first got there, and we'll talk about this
Yeah.
tension and then how it sort of did eventually even out,
Yeah.
I think.
Well, it was interesting to me to watch Frozen River recently, which is about up in that
Oh,
area.
okay.
And that was kind of interesting. It was filmed up there. Not much has changed. But I think the biggest situation was Messina always knew that eventually the Seaway would probably come to their doorstep. But it really is, even now, extremely isolated. And there have been incidents, which I wrote about in my first book, from the very beginning of the settlement. They like to consider themselves to be somewhat independent from the rest of New York. They see themselves as being more Canadian than American, really. And one of the biggest problems they had was when the people from outside came in, they were coming in from areas that may have been more metropolitan. They had accents which identified them as being outsiders. And many of the locals thought that they were taking jobs away from them because the skilled workers and the engineers were many of the ones that came into the area. So it was a big struggle for them.
One thing that a lot of the interviewees mention is how to say this, the different education levels. You had all these engineers and all this, and then, so that was one of the, was that?
It was a big issue for them. I think also just coming to an area where they couldn't go into a clothing store and find their sizes because they said that everybody was short up there. I love that one. Where they didn't have the best liquor for their cocktail parties. But I think many of the people who moved up there were just shocked that this area had just almost been locked in time. And everybody knew by the cars that they drove, the clothes that they wore, that they were outsiders.
Well, a lot of the people say it was like the Wild West or something.
It really was. The drinking and because they were in such an isolated area.
But it turns out, though, they didn't really take any local jobs. In fact, they probably created.
They added some, yeah.
Well, one thing that you go into a lot in the book, and the people that are talking, the effect of the Seaway on this local economy up there. And you were telling me yesterday when I met you about a lot of the local people that end up getting very rich.
They did.
Talk about this effect on the. Well, I guess if 22,000 workers come to an area.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Well, talk a little bit about that and how some of the local people ended up really getting rich.
They did. A lot of the local people ended up being able to set aside money for their retirement because they could work so many hours, and the income was sometimes double, if not triple, what you could make on a normal job.
Didn't they work 6 days a week? And
I think the record for one of the gentlemen I interviewed was he worked 114 days straight without a day off. And you could work as many shifts as you wanted to. You could work days, weeks at a time because they really needed the workers to do that. But in terms of the economy, I had a really interesting conversation with my father because my grandfather delivered produce up there. And my father was talking about just the change in terms of the bars and the stores and the economy up there for that 4 or 5 year time period was just incredible.
sort of modernized
It did for that period of time, but then once the workers left, the town really went back the way it always had been.
Did many stay, or?
Some of them did because they had local ties. Others are retiring up there.
Oh, okay. They're going back from.
Going back.
Well, one of the interesting quotes was from someone that said, "Merchants and single women were more welcoming of the new arrivals."
Yes. Well, one of the articles that came out in the paper before the project even started was that, things like prostitution and crime and, having drunk people on the streets was going to increase as it had on other similar projects.
I didn't know construction workers were had such a
boy.
reputation.
They do. As they said, they worked hard, they partied hard.
Yeah.
Because to them, that was the way that they got out of their minds what had happened on the job that day.
But they were sort of like nomads, and they travel around and.
Called them interlopers. They didn't like that term much, but that's the thing.
Well, one chapter that is really, really interesting, and it's probably, maybe this is sort of a new way of history. You devote a whole chapter to the women who either worked up there or were the wives of the workers. And it's not that it was a forgotten history or anything, but talk about why you included a separate thing on women.
This is actually one of the chapters that my publisher wanted me to eliminate.
Oh, no, I mean, from a sociological point of view, or
Yes.
a window on 1950s America,
Yeah.
and all that, it's these women's voices are very
They're very
they wanted
interesting.
you to take that chapter out?
They did because they thought that it didn't really fit in with the workers' history. But I think one of the things that drew me to it was not only as my mother from that generation, but also they were in a similar situation to where I am at the present time and was when I interviewed them. I have young children.
Yeah.
I am lucky enough to be able to combine my work life and my home life. These women were at a very interesting transition in history. They were, some of them highly educated. One was a veterinarian, one was a nurse, one was a teacher.
These are wives of, like, the engineers?
They are, yeah.
okay.
And they were put in this location in the middle of nowhere, wanting to work, having 3, 4 children, and their husbands were having the time of their lives. And they had to figure out how to survive. And the way that they survived was becoming friends with each other, being a support system, being, as they put it, surrogate sisters and aunts and mothers. And they also were the interviewees who held absolutely nothing back about their experiences or about each other.
The women?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
They criticize each other, and they talk to each other on the phone still on a daily basis. So they, as they put it, had said this, in person already, so it didn't matter. But they really were very honest about it and were a window into a part of history that often
Well, it
gets
is. I
ignored.
think a lot of people have misconceptions about the 1950s in America. But you call the chapter on the women the core of the core.
They were. They had to move every year. This is one of the projects they were on the longest because it was 3 or 4 years. But usually they were picking up and moving their children to a different school, to a different location. And sometimes their husbands would take off for a year at a time without them
Oh, okay.
if it was isolated. So they really had to hold their family together and had to, as they put it, trust that their husbands were behaving when they were on the job.
Well, like I say, this book, for the people watching, it does remind me of Studs Terkel book working, and it has all these voices. I think there's over 50 people are interviewed. One thing that a lot of in the various sections that comes up was the churches. That was a very interesting. We'll talk about how this influx and what people. It was mostly Catholic up there, and that came up a lot in the. Talk a little bit about.
It did. It's one of the things that came up in my first book on the comparative history too, because the religion in that area changed based on the influx of people. At the turn of the 20th century, Alcoa moved in, and they brought in Italians, Armenians. There was a Jewish population that came in then. And what people brought with them, not only at the turn of the 20th century, but here that was the one stable organization in their lives. Even if they moved from, say, Colorado to Messina, they would always go to their church. And that's where the women found, hopefully sometimes a welcoming group of people. Other times they did not. But one of the women commented about, and you probably saw it in the book, about the very heavy Catholic population up there. And she equated it to the number of children that the women had. And she also made a joke, and probably if you're not Catholic, this would be something surprising. Her husband had gone out to lunch on Ash Wednesday with a group of his supervisors.
I read that part. So tell us.
And he came home and he said to his wife, "I almost made a big mistake today. I almost asked them why they had mud on their foreheads today." And they said, well, they explained to me, thankfully, that it was Ash Wednesday.
Well, the chapter before the last chapter is all these people that, like we mentioned earlier, you're cutting them up to talk about different topics. But they all comment on the legacy of the project in construction history or whatever, for lack of a better term, or engineering history, and on their own lives. a lot of them comment that working up there, it set them up for life.
It
But
did.
talk about this section, because it was most interesting how when we talk about Hoover Dam and Panama Canal, everyone knows about these things, and this project was just as just as massive, I guess, and yet it's not really known as well. What talk about why perhaps these guys and yourself from your research, why isn't it more known or more talked about in the annals of
American history? Well, it is. It's a sentence or two in certain books. Even the book on Robert Moses, who played a big role being the head of the Power Authority, in the book on his life, it's a sentence or two. Maybe it's 2 or 3 pages. But I think there are 2 reasons they point to. One is it's where it's located. Geographically, for the Americans, it's in the middle of nowhere. Right. The Canadians know an awful lot about the Seaway. Their celebration for the 50th is huge. They have school children writing about it.
The river is right on, is in Montreal there in Toronto.
It's their central, it's central to their economy and their transportation. The other thing, one of the workers said to me is, it's not the biggest and the brightest anymore, it just functions. People don't think about when they turn the light switch on their wall where their power comes from. But we built it and we know. So there are a lot of variables to it. And also the last thing is, unfortunately, when it was built, and it was completed in 1959, it was already obsolete. Many parts of the Seaway, including the locks, were restricted in size based on a deal we now know between the American government and the Canadian shipping business. The locks could have been 100 feet wide, which would have made them accessible to cargo ships, which in 1959 were already on the horizon. So a lot of people say that one of the reasons why it's not more well known is because of the fact that it is obsolete except for the power production part of it.
Can cargo ships go through those locks?
Too narrow. They get stuck. So they have to offload in Montreal onto Laker ships, which has been a boon for several freight companies in Canada because the shipping companies have to pay them.
So they got to switch to all the stuff from to
smaller ships. And one of the workers said to me, we excavated 100 feet, but about halfway through the project, they told us they only wanted 80 of it, and we never knew why.
Were ships that big back then?
They were getting there at the beginning of the late 50s, early 60s. They were on the horizon.
Well, one thing we didn't talk about, but it sort of permeates, it goes through the book, is the little politics going on in all these aspects of the thing. Well, Claire, this has been great. I would just tell people watching, this book is filled, it's a history book, but it's filled with the voices of workers. And like I say, it reminds me of the Studs Terkel books. And it's just very interesting, and it's a window on the 1950s. And I guess I'll ask you now, so for people watching, maybe they can, what are you working on next? You mentioned maybe people will, are you working on something?
What am I working on next? I have been looking a little bit at the Niagara Falls project, which is where many of these workers moved on to, and was even more deadly than this one, believe it or not. And I'm working on a history of a company that just went out of business in Syracuse called Syracuse China.
Oh, okay. That's right. That's right, your labor history.
Labor history, but I worked there too in high school. So.
Well, the book, the St. Lawrence Seaway and Power Project, we do have it here in the library if you want to come in and check it out, but you can buy it on Amazon and published by Syracuse University Press. So thank you for coming, Claire.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, that's it for Meet the Author this time, and we'll see you next time.